Welcome to the Abridged Presidential Histories with Kenny Ryan, episode 25B, an interview on the international adventures of William McKinley with Robert Merry. I'm excited to welcome Robert Merry to the show today. Bob is a 40-year veteran of Washington journalism as a reporter for the Wall Street Journal for a dozen years, and as the longtime president and editor-in-chief of Congressional Quarterly. He has written 5 books on American history and foreign policy, including A Country of Vast Designs, James K. Polk, The Mexican War, and the Conquest of the American Continent, and President McKinley, Architect of the American Century. You can learn more about him from his website, robertwmerry.com. And now, without further ado, let's dive into President McKinley and the dawn of the American century. Bob, thank you so much for your time.
It's my pleasure, Ken. My pleasure.
So the presidency of William McKinley really seems to be this transformative moment in American foreign policy where we go from like a controlling stake in Samoa to owning Hawaii, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam, and American troops having fought in Cuba and China. I'd love to start with a vocabulary question. People on social media sometimes get upset when the word imperialism starts getting tossed around. Does the United States of America become an imperial power during McKinley's presidency?
Well, there's no question. Absolutely. It did become an imperial power. As you say, when he became president, we didn't have any significant overseas possessions whatsoever. And afterwards, we had the ones that you named, Hawaii, Guam, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico. We also had kicked Spain out of the Caribbean so that became an American lake. We gained dominance over Cuba, although we didn't take possession over Cuba for any appreciable period of time. So absolutely, there's no question at all that that's exactly what happened. I would say that we became an imperialist power, but that it wasn't exactly totally colonial imperialism. Back in those days, if you wanted to be an empire, you had to have colonies. That's why the Germans were going all over the world trying to get colonies, whether they made any sense strategically or not. But America came to it under McKinley, and I think later with a little bit of a different view that you could have a lot of influence in the globe without gaining colonies, which could be problematical anyway. But we can talk about how all that worked out with regard to the Philippines and these other possessions.
Absolutely. We'll dive into that in a bit. And I want to start, like that desire not to say we had colonies, it might stem from the fact that we were a former colony. Our first president set a precedent for basically staying out of world affairs. How did Americans feel about the way they jumped onto the world scene during McKinley's presidency?
Well, Washington did tell us don't go out into the world, but America was becoming a very rich, very big, very powerful country, and it had to go into the world almost by default. It couldn't not employ those levers of power in the world. And so the American people generally were a people of restlessness. I called my book on James K. Polk, A Country of Vast Designs, which was a quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson. We were a country of vast designs and a country of people on the move. And so we consolidated our position on the North American continent through the 1840s and afterwards. And then we busted out into the world. Now, there was opposition. There's always going to be opposition to that. But by and large, the American people were very much enthusiastic about this project in general, that we were a country on the move and that they wanted us to project ourselves into the world.
So McKinley is going to be involved in, let's say, 4 major international episodes. He will annex Hawaii. He will fight the Spanish-American War. He'll fight the Philippine-American War. And he'll send American troops to China to help put down the Boxer Rebellion. I'd love to look at each of those and the arguments for and against involvement in each, and then ultimately what their legacies are. So let's start with the Spanish-American War. What were the arguments for and against war with Spain, and why does McKinley ultimately call for war?
Well, what's really interesting about McKinley is that historians have kind of assumed that William McKinley was a man of sort of passivity, that he wasn't a man of force. My book disputes that view. And that the view is that these events, powerful events that occurred during his presidency, kind of washed over him, and that he wasn't the person who was directing it. But that's not exactly what happened. Now, he had to contend with the fact that there was a great deal of the population that wanted war, and we have to look at a little bit of background here. Cuba had wanted its independence from Spain for decades. There had been two massive, very bloody insurrections, one kind of during our Civil War period that ended in a negotiated settlement, which wasn't really abided by by Spain. And then the one that was going on when McKinley became president. And it was very bloody and brutal. And Spain sent a General Weyler to Cuba to put down the rebellion. And he did so in a brutal fashion by dividing the island into these sort of sections and attempted to pacify the sections one after another. And they became kind of like extended concentration camps. But Spain didn't have either the money, the wherewithal, and the knowledge to protect people who were now sort of under their control, and the people were dying in the thousands. So it was a humanitarian disaster. And America has always been a country with a great deal of humanitarian instinct and impulse. And so there was a great deal of feeling in America that we've got to do something about this. And there was a lot of belligerence. Now, McKinley didn't go into that belligerence. He didn't embrace it at all, which is one of the reasons why a lot of historians and even people at the time thought that he was not on their side in terms of we have to end this situation. But you got to understand that there was also a strategic factor. Here we had this instability and this terrible situation going on 90 miles from our shores, which were threatening to destabilize the entire Caribbean, which was our backyard. And we couldn't allow that to happen. So what McKinley did was he made it clear to Spain that you got to end this thing. I don't care how you end it, he essentially said. You can win, or you can negotiate this thing, or you can get out. But we can't have this destabilized situation. So there was a humanitarian factor, that was a pro. There was the strategic factor, which was less debated in the public discourse, but nevertheless was sort of understood. And that was a pro. What were the cons? Well, I think that the cons were that America had not gone into the world, had not been an empire, had not attempted to project itself, and this would be a terrible precedent.
So what's the legacy of that Spanish-American War? And we'll talk more about the Philippines in a second, so let's set that one aside. But when we go to war over Cuba, we end up taking Guam, Puerto Rico. Those become ours. Cuba, we set free, but have this kind of special relationship. What is the legacy? How does this change America's position in the world?
Well, it changes it profoundly because, as we were saying earlier, and as you noted in introducing this topic, we did not have possessions. We had not really projected ourselves into the world. And afterwards, we couldn't get out of the world. We were stuck, whether we liked it or not. Yeah. But generally, we liked it. But that always is attendant with a great deal of difficulty and problems, unanticipated instability and destabilization, and all of those things, including the Philippine insurrection, which we'll talk about, including Vietnam, including all the rest of it, what we're doing right now with regard to Russia and China, et cetera. So the legacy was profound. It was a turning point in American history. And it was a turning point that occurred not just on McKinley's watch, but because McKinley wanted it to happen. Now, let me sort of backtrack and talk a little bit about what was going on towards this end at when McKinley became president. we're going to talk about Hawaii, but there was a lot going on in terms of America taking possession of Hawaii, which was one of the most significant strategic points on the entire globe. Um, and we were building a navy. Why were we building a navy? Well, we were building a navy because the only reason to build navy is to project power, to either for geopolitical purposes or for trade protection purposes. And we were building a navy. We were angling towards building canal across the Central American Isthmus, which ended up being the Panama Canal. Well, what was the significance of that? Well, with a canal dominated by America, we could project more power with fewer battleships and fewer destroyers than we could without the canal and having to go all around South America. So we were moving in that direction, and we would have moved in that direction with or without McKinley. But McKinley pulled it all together in a lot of ways and made it coherent. So the legacy is profound.
I'm curious, how did this influence our relationship, say, with European powers? Was there any element of, until the United States beat Spain and gets some territories of its own, Europe views us as like a little kid, and once that happens, maybe do they treat us different diplomatically after that, or not really?
Well, that's a very fascinating question. I think that the way to look at that primarily is through the relations between the United States and Britain. And just before McKinley's presidency, we had an episode with Britain involving South America, certain
Venezuela
territories in South America.
Yeah.
That almost led to war with Great Britain. And it was the last time that ever came even close to happening. And why was that? Well, it was right around the time of the turn of the last century, in McKinley's time, in the 1890s, that America, and the statistics were known in those days, that America became the greatest economic power on the globe, replacing Great Britain. And what's amazing about this is that there was not the kind of competition that we're seeing today between China and America, where China is threatening to supplant America as the premier global power, or that we saw at the turn of the last century also between Great Britain and Germany, as Germany emerged as a consolidated power on the continent of Europe, and also started to build a navy that was a direct competitive salient against the British Navy, the Royal Navy. And those tensions, well, the tension between US and China, we don't know where that's going to go, but the tensions between Germany and Great Britain, we know exactly where it went.
Yeah.
It went to World War I,
Yeah.
and that was almost inevitable. But that didn't happen between the United States and Great Britain. And why? Well, I would contend, and I've written extensively about this, a lot of it had to do with the fact that we were essentially root and branch part of the British milieu, if you will, and that Great Britain essentially said, well, we need to partner with these guys because they've got too much power to mess with. And we can have a great partnership, even though we're not going to be necessarily the senior partner in the arrangement. And that's essentially what happened, but it didn't just happen by itself. And here we come to McKinley again, and his Secretary of State, John Hay, one of the greatest secretaries of state in the history of America, fashioned, he had been ambassador to Great Britain under McKinley prior to being Secretary of State. And he was most directly responsible, aside from McKinley, for establishing a relationship with Great Britain that became the special relationship that we've had ever since. So in that sense, in terms of how, and the other European powers, they sort of had to respond to Great Britain anyway, because Great Britain was the global hegemon. So that kind of sort of slipped into place. But we can talk about that more when we get to China, because there's some very interesting aspects of all this in the China episode.
All right, we'll get to China a bit. Next, though, I want to jump to Hawaii, which you mentioned a second ago. And this happens in the middle of the Spanish-American War. We're like in the middle of the fight in this war. We annex Hawaii. Now, that had started a while earlier. The Hawaiian monarchy had been overthrown basically by American sugar planters about a handful of years earlier. They'd been applying for annexation. The previous president, Grover Cleveland, had said no. But then in the middle of the war with Spain is when McKinley says yes. So not when he first becomes president. In the middle of this war is when yes happens. What were the arguments for and against annexation? Why does it happen now?
Yeah, let me say just one little thing as maybe a little bit of a augmentation of what you said. They were American planters in the sense that they came from families that had been American families. But these were people who had been in Hawaii for generations. And they had intermarried with the indigenous people, the Polynesian people of Hawaii extensively. In fact, the last queen, the queen who was overthrown of Hawaii, was married to an American, not an American citizen, a Hawaiian citizen of American descent.
Huh.
And so these people had immense economic power in the Hawaiian Islands because sugar, that was what they were planting, is a hugely profitable crop. And especially in the industrial world, canning was becoming a significant way of preserving foods, and that required sugar, and that exploded the demand for sugar worldwide. So these people were immensely rich, but they didn't have political power. And so there was, in fact, as you say, essentially a kind of a coup or revolution, largely bloodless, but not entirely, in which they took over and upended the monarchy. Well, there was a American military naval ship that was in Hawaii at the time, and there was a sort of a collusion aspect to all this, and America had bloody hands on all of this. And the President Cleveland, before McKinley, was aghast at all this, and he didn't want to have anything to do with this whole thing, in which the American captain, naval captain, and the American heritage folks of Hawaii were interested in getting the annexation of Hawaii to America, making Hawaii part of the United States. But McKinley came in and he immediately reversed the McKinley view because he, in fact, did want Hawaii. And I think that there was economic reasons because it was huge economic benefit for America to have that. But strategic reasons, if you look at a map, the entire Pacific Ocean is just this vast water, except for Hawaii. So if you want to project power from America eastward into Asia, Hawaii is crucial. And if you want to prevent America from projecting power, then from into Asia, then it's crucial for Asians, in this case it would have been the Japanese, to get control of Hawaii. And the Japanese had a legitimate concern because there were an awful lot of Japanese who had gone over there to work in the fields and weren't all that well treated, which was an issue that Japan had with Hawaiian leaders, number one. And number two, Japan understood the strategic significance. And McKinley did too. And he basically said, this is as crucial as getting California was when Polk was president. So yeah, he did foster that, and it wasn't that easy. There was a lot of opposition. We talked earlier about the opposition to all of this, and I could name some of them. I wrote them down here. I could name some of the people who were opposed to Hawaii and a lot of these other imperial actions. House Speaker Thomas Reed, they called him Czar Reed because he was so powerful. He hated the idea. Mark Twain, especially in the Philippines. Andrew Carnegie, the industrialist, the industrial financier. William Jennings Bryan, McKinley's political opponent. And one of my favorites, Edwin Godkin. Edwin Godkin was one of the most influential journalists of the day. He was editor of both the Nation magazine and the New York Post. So there was a lot of opposition, but McKinley got it through the Senate and the House. It was not done as a treaty. It was done as a piece of legislation, which meant it didn't need 2/3 of the Senate. And that's how we got Hawaii. Oh, but let me just say, Ken, if I could, so suppose when America was having difficulties with Japan, instead of Japan attacking Pearl Harbor by way of moving west to threaten the United States West Coast, suppose Japan had attacked the West Coast from Hawaii, which it would have been able to do, but wasn't able to do until it had Hawaii.
Right. Exactly. It's one of those like kind of what ifs of history, you know?
Yes, indeed.
And I did see like a lot of the arguments I often read for picking up a lot of these territories was, well, if the United States doesn't do it, someone else will.
Well, Germany was right there, and so was Japan, and either one of them, they might have even fought each other for it, but both Germany and Japan were hovering, and they really, really wanted Hawaii.
And actually, so I was going to ask, what's the legacy of this decision? Is that part of it? Is part of the legacy that we had Hawaii to be our buffer in World War II? Are there other parts of this legacy?
That was the most direct example, but it was written in what didn't happen. We were not challenged from Asia because it was almost impossible to challenge the United States from Asia, so long as the United States had that single point in the Pacific from which you could dominate the Pacific.
Very interesting. All right, so at the end of the Spanish-American War, next big one we've talked about a few times, we decided to keep the Philippines. And a brutal civil war breaks out soon between not civil war, kind of war of independence between American soldiers and Filipinos who wanted that independence. What were the arguments for holding on to the Philippines, for staying and fighting for the Philippines? And what were the arguments for leaving the Philippines? What were the arguments for saying, you know what, just set them free? And what convinced McKinley to stay and fight and try to keep them?
Well, that was a complex, it's a complex question for today. It was a complex reality in McKinley's day. So we got to step back just a touch. And I mentioned we were building a Navy. We were building a Navy before McKinley. And why were we building a Navy? Well, because we were becoming a global trading country, and we had to make sure that we could protect our trading routes. And so we were building this big Navy. And whereas the Brits were very concerned about the Germans building one because the Germans were so close and could consolidate power on Europe, which would be a threat to Great Britain and to England. The American Navy, because we were so isolated, we were able to build this Navy and nobody was trying to stop us. But what do you need when you have a global Navy? You need coaling stations. Mm-hmm. And because the Navy, the ships are worthless if they don't have coal and they don't have power. Yeah. And so what do you need if you have coaling stations? Well, you need to be able to protect those coaling stations, which means you probably need land mass around your coaling stations so that you can install enough troops and military power to protect your little coaling station. And if you're going to do that, you have to have you have to be able to protect the protective landmass around your coaling station. So that conundrum was distilled when we took the Philippines. And McKinley was sort of open-minded about it. He didn't say, well, we're going to take everything that we got, although he said we're going to take everything that we want after we get what we can, almost in those words. And so he looked at the Philippines. So the question was, well, we're certainly going to have a coaling station, and the best place to have a coaling station is in Subic Bay on Luzon Island. Okay, fine. We have to have all of Luzon Island, because if we don't have Luzon Island, we can't protect the coaling station. Mm-hmm. But if we don't have the rest of the Philippines, how are we going to protect Luzon Island? And if we just leave the rest, it's going to be a free-for-all. And the industrial West was in a position to basically dominate the Philippines. They were powerless to the Western powers. So that meant that there was going to be a free-for-all. There was going to be probably a feeding frenzy where the Germans and probably the Brits and the Russians perhaps and the Japanese now were going to go in and essentially carve it up like they'd been doing in China. And so he said, no, we can't allow that. For two reasons. Number one, it's not strategically viable. But secondly, it's a humanitarian disaster. And we are the liberators. Well, now, Mr. Aguinaldo, the great, really brilliant guerrilla fighter against American hegemony in the Philippines wouldn't have seen it that way, and a lot of Filipinos didn't see it that way. But McKinley saw it that way, and he had a touch of humanitarianism. And as I say, America always had kind of an impulse towards the humanitarian outlook, unlike other nations of that period of Western imperialism. So he put those two things together and said, we got to take the whole thing.
Got it.
Now, I will say that the war that erupted, the guerrilla war, was a real mess. I mean, we don't tend to think of it that way, but most of the people living in America today kind of understand what Vietnam was like. But the Philippines threatened to be like Vietnam and came kind of close because it looked like it could become a quagmire. But we managed to get through that without too much ripping and tearing of the political fabric of America. But it was a close call.
What is the legacy of the Filipino-American War and keeping the Philippines? How was American history or the American character changed by us fighting to hold on to the island chain?
Well, it's not clear what kind of a war we would have had with Japan if we hadn't had the Philippines as well as Hawaii. Mm-hmm. So we became a Asian power. We became a Pacific power, and the Philippines was the linchpin of that in terms of getting into Asia itself. And so I would say that the legacy was huge in terms of the outcome of World War II, or the way the outcome of World War II was affected, and what the cost of that victory was. And it projected us into Asia and made us an Asian power. And ultimately, it made us an Asian power with or without the Philippines, because after World War II, we had the biggest Navy. Nobody could touch us. Yeah. We had the Philippines, we had Hawaii, we had Guam, we had the Marianas. So we had positioned ourselves to dominate the Pacific, and we dominated the Pacific and Asia for 70 years. All that's under challenge now, but that was a pretty significant development.
All right, last international adventure, we've briefly mentioned it, China. Around 1900, Chinese peasants organized a massive revolt against foreign powers who, as you mentioned, were carving out growing spheres of influence and concessions within China. McKinley dispatched troops to join the fight to end the rebellion. There were like 8 countries that were part of this army to put down the rebellion. What were the arguments for and against sending troops all the way into China? Like, you cannot get much further away from the United States to participate in this intervention.
Yeah, just a little bit of background on that as well. You mentioned these countries carving up China. China was a basket case nation. It had fought the opium. It had been basically just kind of stomped over by Britain in the Opium Wars. And it had been sort of laid bare. It was a basket case of a country. The last dynasty, I don't know how it's pronounced, but it's spelled Qing. The last dynasty was falling apart, and so was the country, and it was vulnerable to this carving up. But there was one other element that's worth noting, and that was the missionaries, the French Catholics and the American Protestant missionaries, who had amassed a great deal of power within this chaotic nation, and was affecting the culture of China in ways that the leadership and the former people who were the elites were very uncomfortable with. So not only was there a great deal of anti-Western, and Japan was part of all this too, so anti-Japanese feeling, fervor among Chinese rank and file, ordinary citizens, but even the leaders, who of course had a responsibility to act somewhat responsibly in terms of international relations, but they hated it too, and so they allowed a lot of abuse of Westerners, and they were being killed, and they were being abused and traduced, and they in fright. These Western, mostly diplomats, but other traders and others, got themselves into the diplomatic compound in Beijing, Peking then, and were sort of holed up. And they were besieged by not millions, but thousands of Chinese citizens who were bent on basically slaughtering them. So it wasn't really a question of these Western powers going into China to take over, although they had been taking over,
Right.
basically forcing the Chinese to accept and acquiesce in losing ports and harbors and strategic locations, and it was a feeding frenzy. And so America joined that. Now, America didn't believe in entangling alliances. So under McKinley, we were not supposed to be aligning ourselves with these other leaders, but that proved to be sort of impossible and utterly unrealistic, and made McKinley administration look a little bit hapless initially. But they kind of realized they had to be part of this Western phalanx, because otherwise, and there was weeks that went by in which we thought that they had been slaughtered. So you can imagine how people in America were feeling about this situation. But through Western ingenuity and military brilliance, really, we managed to get troops to Beijing to protect these people. And then the question was, okay, we have to negotiate the outcome of this with the Chinese. And here's where McKinley is very interesting. Many of the Western powers, especially Germany, wanted to sort of take a vengeance role, a vengeance approach, revenge. McKinley said no, and McKinley said no. We're going to end this feeding frenzy through the open door policy, where everybody can come in and trade, but nobody is going to be taking advantage of the situation vis-a-vis other Western powers. And what emerged out of that was, in my view, is the concept of non-colonial imperialism. So that America said, essentially, we're not going to take any of these ports, or not like Hong Kong, or not like Shanghai, or what the British had, all these 5 ports that they'd sort of taken over. We're not going to do that, and we're not going to let anyone else do that anymore if we can stop it. And because we had developed so much power and influence, and this was really the first time we'd ever demonstrated this kind of power and influence, we were able to dominate the negotiations with the Chinese in a way that was beneficial to the Chinese, and moved the world, the West in China, away from the feeding frenzy. So it was a very significant development in that regard. And I think it was pivotal in creating the kind of what you might call non-colonial imperialism, or you might even call it somewhat benign imperialism, although it's never really benign, that America projected after World War II, kind of fashioned in greater detail and a greater sense of a whole by Franklin Roosevelt.
So you mentioned the term feeding frenzy a couple times, and I often see this phrase when I was reading about it as, McKinley did not want China to get carved up. How real was that threat? Like, was Germany sitting there saying, we want 1/8, and Japan gets 1/8, and Britain gets 1/8? Like, was there a threat China would have been totally dismembered, the same way that Europe had done to the Middle East and Africa and Latin America? I mean, there's a long history before this of just taking big places and carving it up and handing out slices. Was that a threat with China?
Well, it certainly looked like it, and it may have been to a significant extent, but I don't think China. I think China was too big and had too much of a strong sense of itself to ultimately be carved up for all time. I think, and I think that the history of China since that period would demonstrate that there's a lot of fiber there, and they weren't going to. Ultimately, they were going to be able to find a way to reemerge as a significant player from this abject adversity that they were experiencing. But that's an open question, and one can debate, what might have happened endlessly. I try to avoid debating what might have happened.
Totally. Yeah, I totally picture an alternate universe where, China looks like the Middle East or something right now. But you're right. Who knows? It might have pulled itself back together no matter what. Um, the one more question I got for you is: so we talked about all these crises where we sent troops or whether we acquired territory. Why didn't we turn these places we acquired into states real quick? Why didn't we say, all right, we got the Puerto Rico, let's make it a state. We got Guam, let's make it a state. Why wasn't that a push? It seems like that's part of like how it's supposed to function.
Well, I think there are a couple of factors here. I think that there's probably some, ethnic prejudice involved. In fact, when the debates about Hawaii annexation were raging, one of the senators got up in the Senate and said, "Okay, I'm weighing this, and I may be with you, but I want to make sure I understand. We're not talking about making Hawaii a state, are we?" And the answer was, I can't remember the senator who was running the Foreign Affairs Committee at that time, but said Foreign Relations Committee said, "Oh no, we wouldn't consider that." And then also, I think that in case of Guam or Puerto Rico, I just don't think they were considered to be large enough to be states. So they sort of were put into the territorial status from the beginning, and it wasn't really much of a debate or a contention in America regarding that. Hawaii, of course, and Alaska, our last two states,
Yep.
were a different factor, but they were larger, and there wasn't so much of the ethnic question with regard to Alaska. But there certainly was with Hawaii, but it's worked out fine.
What can we learn from the way McKinley led the country through these foreign crises? Is there a lesson in leadership here?
I think there is. And some of my reviewers, when I wrote the McKinley book, suggested that as well. I had a problem writing about McKinley because McKinley was a man who led by indirection. And he wasn't a man of force or overt force, but he always seemed to get his own way. And so I tried, and he didn't keep a diary. He didn't write many letters even. So it was really hard to get a take on this guy. I wrote about James K. Polk, and he kept this amazing diary through his presidency. I knew what he was thinking, and almost on everybody and everything. And so that you could really sort of get into it. And it was really hard with McKinley. Well, I developed this motif, which was the mystery of William McKinley. How did he accomplish all this stuff in this sort of indirection way? Well, he did accomplish it. And he did do it because he wanted to do it. What happened during his presidency largely was a product of the things that he wanted to happen. So that was kind of the McKinley leadership. Now, there was a congressman by the name of Butterworth, Ben Butterworth, who was a Republican. He didn't like McKinley that much personally, it appears from his letters. But he was very, very close to Mark Hanna, who was McKinley's sort of chief go-to guy and his chief operative on anything that he needed done. And he described McKinley in a way that I really liked, and I think it really captures him. He says, if I were walking through an apple orchard with Bill McKinley that had but two producing apple trees, and on one of those trees that we were walking under had but two apples, Will would grab both apples, he'd put one in his pocket, he'd take a bite out of the other one, and he'd turn to me and say, "Do you like apples, Ben?" And he was trying to say that there was a certain sense of entitlement with McKinley. He always took what he wanted.
Yeah.
But he always did it in such a pleasant way that no one could really get too angry with him. And he got away with an awful lot. So that was the McKinley leadership. And you can say that it was stealthy, and maybe it wasn't always entirely overt. Maybe he was not always kind of honest, but it was very civil and respectful of other points of view. And I think that the lesson for our time, when we're living through an era of American political internal hostility and meanness, is that a little bit of McKinleyism might not be such a bad idea.
Awesome. If you'd like to hear more from Bob, please check out his books, including President McKinley, Architect of the American Century. Thank you so much for your time, Bob.
Pleasure. Enjoyed being with you.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Abridged Presidential Histories. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, tell your friends about the show, leave a 5-star review on your podcast listening platform of choice. Really appreciate it when you tell your friends about the show. I love seeing more people come and find us. You can also follow the show on Facebook at Abridged Presidential Histories or on Twitter at APH Podcast. If you would like to support the show, you can look it up on Patreon or go directly to www.patreon.com/Abridged Presidential Histories. Helps me buy books and pay to host the show, and thank you everyone who's contributed so far. The music in today's podcast is a public domain recording of the United States Army Old Guard Fife and Drum Corps. In our next episode, a big one, we will get to the life and presidency of Theodore Roosevelt, and we're going to focus on the episodes that turned him from like D-list politician to the president that we know today. What made TR TR? That's next time on Abridged Presidential Histories.